And I would say that in the aftermath of Russia, that is a really, really stupid position to take. But in a cult of personality, taking stupid positions is, I don't think we're looking at either of those scenarios. The Russians are utterly incapable of providing an alternative pole. And that's one of the reasons why no one has really sided with them in any meaningful way in the Ukraine war. Their economy just can't support it. Their infrastructure can't support it. Their technological system has apparently failed, and their demographics are terminal. So none of these things are likely to get much better. They may be able to eventually fully mobilize and bring more of their industry into the fight. I'm a little surprised that hasn't happened already, considering the stakes. But that is for Russia. That is for their near abroad. That is for trying to establish an outer crustal defense. That is not to become an independent pole. And then the Chinese, they're a massive exporter, which means that they need markets to dump all their product on. And so there is no sort of partnership with the Chinese that allows another country to do well. They just become a dumping ground or a source of raw materials. So people might want, the dream situation for a lot of countries is the Americans provide the security and the Chinese provide the economic access. But that wasn't ever going to work, even if politics in the United States supported it, which it does not. The Chinese moment is almost over because of demographic situations. So I don't think we'll see a hot war with these two powers. I don't think we'll even see a meaningful Cold War more than a few years with the Chinese. The Russians, the goal here of the West is to support Ukraine as much as possible, because as long as Ukraine is in the fight, so long as Ukraine is independent, the Russians can't get that outer crustal defense, and they will be constantly on the strategic defensive until they disassociate. I don't think that's going to happen this decade. I think the Russians have a lot more road ahead of them than the Chinese, but it does put them in a bit of a box. And as for Europe and the rest, to get back to where we were during the Cold War economically, I don't think that's possible either. What made the global system work is the United States subsidized everybody's security systems and then provided global coverage navally so that anyone could ship anything to anywhere. We no longer have a Navy that is built for that. And one of the things we've seen in, say, the Persian Gulf of late is the Iranians have now grabbed, I believe, a half a dozen tankers. And aside from issuing a press release, the U.S. Navy has done nothing. Had that happened in the 70s or the 80s, we would have sunk quite a few Iranian naval assets and probably taken out a few offshore oil platforms to boot. But we no longer have the destroyer-heavy force that is necessary to patrol the seas for global commerce. We're heavy on supercarriers now. And in that sort of environment, we can't provide the security, and you could even argue we can't provide the economic subsidization anymore. Because remember, we now, the United States, we do have a substantial number of millennials and young people to provide that consumption-led system. Europe no longer does. So there just aren't enough people in wealthy countries that are in that consumption-driven stage of their life to support global commerce anymore. And there's certainly not in Japan or Korea or China or Germany or Italy. So we need a new economic model everywhere except Southeast Asia and North America. There, the old system can work, and that's why these systems are getting tighter and tighter and closer together economically. But that is not a global trade order. That's a regional trade order, and that can work. But it does leave everyone else on the outside. Oh, absolutely. That's why. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you look back at Europe's history, it's a little rough. And so coming up with a political economic model that kept political protest under control and incorporated it into the political system rather than involving shooting, this is a big win for Europe. But because of the urbanization trend, it's been a one-off. What we're going to see over the next decade, maybe 2 decades, is as the United States pulls away from maintaining the economic coherence of the broader system, the EU, I think, is going to go away. As the Germans hit mass retirement this decade, it's going to be impossible for the Germans to pay for the existence of the European Union. If you take the single biggest provider of funds and turn them into a net beneficiary, there's no way the EU can survive in that environment. You will have countries leaving left and right, with probably the French the first out the door. The French, ironically, have one of the best demographies in the advanced world. And so the idea of France being the single largest payer into EU in order to subsidize the existence of Germany, oh my, I don't see that happening. The French plan since the beginning is to get the Germans to pay for everything. It's not going to work once we get to that point, which means that we're going to get a regional breakup of the European system. You'll probably get a Scandinavian network where the demographics are pretty good and the partnership with London and Washington is tight. We're seeing that already with the Swedes and the Finns moving towards NATO. You're definitely going to get a Francophone world that is all its own. Iberia will probably, under Mexican sponsorship, apply for NATO membership. And then there's the big open question of what happens in Central Europe, because that's where the demographic decline is most extreme. And unlike the Italians, they're on the wrong side of the Alps. They can't be a pocket power by themselves that's easy for the US to pick up. It's just too big of an area with too entrenched of economic issues. And so the question in the United States will be, are there countries in the future for Europe that we are willing to pay for them to continue to exist? And before you rule that out completely, remember, we've done that for Israel and Armenia and Egypt and Jordan for a very long time. So you can't rule it out. It's just that Germany is a lot of water to carry. That's a big place with a big economy, and supporting it will not be cheap. This is not Greece. This is a real hefty place. That'll be expensive.
Sure.
Well, that's like an hour presentation right there. Okay, let's start with the nukes because that's the simplest. I don't think they're going to come into play anytime soon, if they do come into play at all. There's no reason for Russia to nuke Ukraine because they want to occupy it. There was a moment last year when if they would have nuked, say, Warsaw, Berlin, and Stockholm, they could have disrupted the weapon flows. But in the aftermath of the Battle of Kharkiv, when the Ukrainians captured so much Russian equipment, that logic largely went away. And any direct strike on the United States will be met with an immediate retaliation. And the United States has made it very clear to Vladimir Putin personally that if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, the first few that come back are coming for you personally. And we know exactly where you are, because we've been listening to your phone calls and reading your emails since the beginning of this and then publishing everything immediately. So don't think that you're insulated from this if you decide to go down that route. So I think that is off the table so long as the battle remains within Ukraine. Now, as for the curtain, it's a lot less substantial than it was during the Cold War. And that all had to do with the Battle of Kiev. When it became apparent that the Russians were incompetent, not just at combined arms warfare, but warfare in general, that this was just a mob with weapons, everyone in Washington got really scared, because we know that when the Russians are done with Ukraine, they're coming for Poland. And NATO needed to get ready for that. But when it became apparent that this was actually a fair fight in Ukraine, an underarmed, undertrained force versus the world's second largest standing army, and it was a fair fight somehow, everyone got worried, because if the Russians are able to subdue Ukraine, when they come to Poland, it's not going to be a fight. It's going to be a slaughter. NATO forces versus Russia, you're talking about casualty ratios in excess of 100 to 1,000 to 1. I mean, it'll be a blowout. And in that scenario, the Russians will use nukes. So the decision was made early that any weapons system that the Ukrainians can prove that they can operate and maintain, very important detail, maintain, they can have. And so we've just been steadily ratcheting up the technical assistance in order to help them absorb as much as possible. F-16s are the newest one, and this will continue. Because as long as we keep the fight in Ukraine, then we don't have to worry about a general nuclear exchange over Poland or Romania or Latvia or now Finland. The risk moving forward, and I don't think we're going to reach this year, is let's say the Ukrainians are wildly successful and they manage to get the Russians out of all of their territory inside, including Crimea. That doesn't stop the war. The Russians will keep pushing until they can't. Now that they've paid the price for a war but gotten none of the benefits, they can't back down now. It would lead to government disintegration. Russia usually faces revolutions when it's defeated in a war, which means that Ukraine has to cross the border into Russia to break up the logistical capacity of the Russians to launch the war in the first place. And at a minimum, that means neutralizing Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don.